Very much, Elvira. Appreciate the opportunity to be here again, and uh, looking forward to addressing a topic that is a little bit past its due date, but nevertheless still is of some significance here in Minnesota. And it is the 50th anniversary of the Watergate break-in. I kind of keyed this presentation to events over the summer, and I've given this presentation at a few different places over the course of the summer. But this is, I think, the first and my last presentation that'll be directed primarily, if not exclusively, to people in the legal profession. Much of what I'm going to talk about is not necessarily legal, but it leads up to some of the cases that were decided in Minnesota concerning Watergate-related matters. I deem Minnesota to be the ground zero of Watergate. Watergate, as we'll see, started here. It continued here, and it ended in Minnesota, unbeknownst to many people, including myself. When I first got into this, started exploring the Minnesota connections with Watergate, I was unaware of the sizable connections, linkage between Minnesota and Watergate. So let's move on here. If I can figure out how to move the machine. Elvira, I need some help already.
Got a clicker right here. So this just click forward.
Okay.
Let's do this, get that clicked in there, and now try it.
There we go. All right. This is kind of our overview of what we're going to talk about here as we recall the 50th anniversary of Watergate. And even though the 50th anniversary of Watergate has passed us a little bit because it happened in June, events going on around the country, especially in the nation's capital these days, certainly reflect and recall some parallels between what we're seeing now in the nation's capital, particularly with the January 6th concerns that parallel in some ways what happened during Watergate. In some ways differ significantly from what happened in Watergate, but much of the foundation that's for what's going on in today is really traceable to Watergate and traceable to Minnesota as well. Some facts and figures about Watergate. The break-in was on Friday night, June 16th, Saturday morning, June 17th. It was not the first break-in. The 5 burglars, and there were 5 of them, there were 2 lookouts across the street in a Howard Johnson motel, but there were 5 burglars who broke in. They were led by James McCord. Mr. McCord had been an old CIA hand, and his specialty in the CIA was bugging and wiretapping. He had migrated from the CIA to become the security chief, the head of security for the Committee to Re-elect the President, known by the acronym CREEP. So McCord was the CREEP security chief. He recruited, or there were recruited for him, 4 Confederates who broke into the Watergate. They were known as the 4 Cubans. All of them lived in Miami. All of them were Cuban natives. Some of them had connections to the Bay of Pigs and had been involved in other Cuban and Castro antagonistic type of events. Those were the 5 burglars. This was the 3rd break-in. It was not the first break-in. They had broken in earlier and planted bugs in the telephones, tapping the phones, and they had a mission accomplished. They returned a second time because the bugs weren't picking up everything, and they weren't working so well. The second time they attempted to break in but didn't get in. There was a security man at the desk, and they were deterred from getting in there because there was security in the building at that time. So this was the 3rd break-in, and as we all recall, they were discovered and apprehended when a security guard who was doing his rounds that morning saw this tape that they had taped to the door, and that led him to call the police, and the police then came into the 17th floor and arrested the burglars. But this was the 3rd break-in, not the first. There's been speculation even to today as to what they were doing, or in other words, why the break-in, what was their motivation. And there's never really been a conclusive, definitive determination of what they were looking for. So, even though there have been numerous trials and testimony from the burglars themselves and others, there has, as I said, been no definitive determination of what the purpose of the break-ins were. Many thought then and still think that the goal was to find incriminating data about fundraising by the Democrats. That was, of course, an election year. 1972 was presidential election year. And one theory is that they were trying to find that they thought that there was a lot of dirty money that the Democrats had collected, and they were trying to find that and expose it. Another theory, and these may overlap, all these theories may have been applicable, and maybe all of the above plus more, is that they were looking for information that the Democrats had about the Republicans. It was a defensive break-in, which they were trying to find out what the Democrats had on the Republicans, especially fundraising matters. The Democratic National Committee chair at that time was Lawrence O'Brien. He was an old Democratic hand, a Kennedy man. He had been the Postmaster General. He later became the National Basketball Association president. In fact, the championship of the National NBA championship trophy is called the Lawrence O'Brien Trophy for his service as the NBA president for a number of years after Watergate. But he was the DNC chair at the time and a rather prolific fundraiser himself. Another theory is that they were looking for a list of prostitutions and John list that Democrats supposedly allegedly used to entertain dignitaries and others while they were in DC. So there was a supposed John's list that and prostitution list, which was never found, by the way. So those are some of the theories, and as I said, they may all be applicable. They may be all of the above or none of the above. The burglary was referred to. It happened on Saturday. Excuse me, early Saturday morning. And we'll get to that in a minute. And on Tuesday, the president, Nixon himself, was out of town. He was at the San Clemente White House over that weekend. So he wasn't there. He came back then on Monday, and Monday was kind of a non-activity. Nothing much happened on Monday, but on Tuesday morning, this break-in was on Saturday. On Tuesday morning, Ron Ziegler, the president's press secretary, held his daily briefing. It's the same daily briefing we see on television these days. They didn't do it on television then, but it's the same it's the same type of daily briefing in the press room, standing behind that same podium. And they weren't as elaborate an affair then, because I said they weren't televised, but he did a daily briefing, and he gave a briefing of what Nixon had done over the weekend. There were some issues about tariffs that were being examined and some other rather mundane issues. At the end of the press briefing, as Ziegler is walking away from the podium, someone asked him, "Hey, Ron, what about this break-in at the Democratic National Committee over the weekend?" Up until that time, and even thereafter, as I'll mention in a few minutes, the break-in was almost a non-issue. It was viewed as a local crime issue, local break-in, burglary. The only paper that the only media that paid any attention to was the Washington Post. And as I'll mention in a few moments, the Washington Post reference to the break-in was very brief, very sparse, and treated almost as a police blotter situation. No significance was attributed to it at that time. And Ziegler responded when he asked, "What about this break-in at the Democrats' headquarters?" And Ziegler said, "That's a, quote, third-rate burglary." It's one of the famous quotes that stuck with him through Watergate. And he said it is of, quote, "no concern," unquote, to the president. That was at the 10 a.m. press briefing of that day. At 11 a.m. in the Oval Office, Nixon was conferring with Haldeman. Bob Haldeman was the chief of staff, and a very powerful chief of staff, Nixon's. Nixon and Haldeman were meeting at 11 o'clock, 1 hour after Ziegler, about the same time really, because Ziegler's press briefing took till about 10:30. But shortly after the press briefing, Nixon and Haldeman alone in the Oval Office. We don't know what they talked about specifically, expressly, because that is the 18-minute tape gap. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. But as you may recall, and many of you probably do recall it because you probably lived through Watergate, Nixon, of course, taped all of the conversations in the Oval Office, unbeknownst to just about everybody, including apparently Haldeman. But and those tapes ultimately surfaced during the impeachment proceedings. But that particular tape, the 11 a.m. June 19th tape, has that 18-minute gap. And there's been a lot of speculation, and not even speculation, a lot of conjecture and some evidence as to how it happened and who did it. If you recall, Rosemary Wood, the president's president's secretary, said that she accidentally erased the tape while she was recording something, and then there's a famous picture of her leaning over her desk, showing how she accidentally hit the erase button. Many people don't ascribe much credibility to that, but at any rate, the 18 minutes are missing. However, to his credit, Mr. Haldeman was a terrific note taker. And his notes, he took notes which were preserved and ultimately were gathered as part of the evidence in the criminal proceedings. But Haldeman's notes are almost it's almost like a stenographer, because his notes indicate the discussion between him and Nixon that morning. That was the morning that Ziegler said it was of no concern to the president. It was a third-rate burglary. What Nixon and Haldeman talked about is what to do about that third-rate burglary. And Nixon instructed Haldeman to go to the CIA and have the CIA take the position that it was a matter of national security, and therefore they couldn't discuss it. And there was a significant discussion between Haldeman and Nixon about doing that, and Haldeman bought into that, and that was Plan A. We'll get the CIA to come forward and say it's a national security matter. It was our operatives, but it's because it's a sensitive matter of national security, we can't talk about it. And as we all know, matters of national security are sacrosanct, and no one can ever discuss or reveal anything about national security. At least back then they couldn't. Haldeman then dispatches his deputy to talk to the CIA, and he went to Vernon Walters, who was the deputy chief of the CIA, and asked them if they will take the fall on this. Walters didn't know what he was talking about, because there had been almost no discussion about the media attention had been scant. This is early in the week after Watergate break-in, and the proposition that the CIA take the fall on this or take the blame or credit for it was rejected. He said, we're not going to get into that. We didn't know anything about it either. Why should we take the blame for this? It's not our operation. And so Haldeman's deputy reported back to Haldeman, and Haldeman reported back to Nixon, and that was the end of Plan A. Then they went to Plan B, which is the cover-up. But Plan A was to ascribe this to the CIA. Incidentally, J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI had died a month before Watergate, May 5th, 1972. Hoover died. Had Hoover still been alive, the whole matter may have been handled and investigated quite differently, because Hoover was not a friend of Nixon's. Hoover and Nixon were not on good terms. Hoover wasn't on good terms with a lot of presidents, but Hoover and the FBI may have treated the matter somewhat differently, because there was a vacancy then as Hoover died, and the President Nixon put in one of his own operatives into Hoover's spot. That was L. Patrick Gray, and Gray was ultimately accused of and admitted that he destroyed a lot of documents that were gathered in the early part of the investigation. Gray also was feeding information to John Dean about the investigation. So Hoover's absence at the FBI probably had a significant impact on the cover-up. It helped the cover-up. The CIA's refusal to take the fall on it also facilitated the cover-up, or at least precipitated the cover-up, among other features. So at any rate, that's kind of how the process initially evolved. Then here's some of the cast of characters, and here's where I play a role. So I'll kind of step up to the plate at this point. As everybody knows, Bernstein and Woodward were the young reporters who broke the story. In the early days of Watergate, no one was paying any attention to it, they ran with it, and that's where the first Minnesota connection comes in. Maybe the first Minnesota connection comes in earlier, because I was interviewing for a job the year previously with the Washington Post. The year before Watergate, I was still in law school, and I was interviewing for a job and trying to trying to create a job for myself at the Washington Post. And what I wanted to do was, when I got out of law school, I wanted to become a legal reporter, and I wanted to work for the Washington Post. And I tried to convince them that I could do it and they should hire me. Well, they thought about it and ultimately said, well, we don't really want a lawyer in the newsroom. In those days, lawyers were few and far between in the news media. Nowadays, I think you have to have a law degree to be in the news media sometimes. But back then, that wasn't the case. And they said, well, you know, we don't want someone with legal training to be in the newsroom. We want pure journalists, although I was one of those two. But they did offer me a job anyway. They offered me a job covering the Northern Virginia beat, suburban beat. That would be covering school board meetings, city council meetings, zoning commission meetings, park and recreation boards in the Northern Virginia suburbs. I rejected that opportunity because I thought I wanted to start covering the Supreme Court right from the get-go, and they didn't have that in mind for me. So I rejected that job, ultimately continued my law school career, continued law school, and ultimately practice more law than journalism, although I do a little bit of both. At any rate, that was a job I rejected. That job went to someone else. The person who got that job was Bob Woodward. Bob Woodward was the Northern Virginia beat reporter for the Washington Post. When Watergate broke, they contacted him. As you may recall from the movie, Robert Redford played Woodward. And I think Redford would have been I would have been a better character for Redford than Woodward, but Woodward got the job but at any rate, that Saturday morning, Woodward was in bed by himself, and he got this phone call from the city desk saying, "Hey, Woodward, there's been a burglary, a break-in at the Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate." And Woodward didn't even know what the Watergate was. Watergate was a fairly prominent building at that time, but wasn't a household word. It was commercial complex, residential complex. Some of its occupants, not back then, but subsequently included Bob Dole lived in the Watergate, Monica Lewinsky lived in the Watergate, but back then they didn't live there. But anyway, Watergate was a prominent building in DC, but not one that Woodward knew. He said, "What's that all about?" And they said, "Well, get your butt down to the courthouse because these 5 guys are being arraigned down there." So Woodward gets out of bed at 8:30 in the morning on Saturday and goes down to the Washington, D.C. criminal night court, and sees these 5 guys being arraigned. And he writes a short story on it. And that's the first story about Watergate that appeared in the Post. It was on page 3, and it was a 3-paragraph story about the burglary that occurred that day. The Post assigned him to that position, or delegated him to go there because it was Saturday morning. They didn't think it was any political case, and he was about the lowest person on the and rank there, so he got the assignment to go over there. When he comes back to write his short story, it's Saturday morning. The newsroom was pretty vacant, and there was one fellow hanging around there, Carl Bernstein. Bernstein was a gopher for the Post. He had written a couple of things, but he edited some copy, was a kind of a messenger. But he had no prominence in the newsroom. He wasn't on the reporting staff. It was just kind of a hanger-on there who hung around the newsroom doing odd tasks. Bernstein then talked Woodward and Bernstein, who barely knew each other at the time. Bernstein, "What are you doing?" And Woodward said, "Well, there was a break-in at the headquarters. I'm writing a short story on it." Bernstein says, "Oh, well, okay. Hey, I'm kind of interested in that. If there's anything I can do, let me help you." So Woodward said, "Well, I don't think there's anything to do. I just got the short story here." But that's how the connection first began between Woodward and Bernstein. Here are some of the other Watergate characters, and I'll talk about some. Most of them we know. One of the significant ones that I mentioned, that I alluded to before, is Mark Felt. Mark Felt was the deputy FBI director. He was second in command to Hoover. Hoover died May 5th, 1972, before Watergate. Felt thought he would get that position. He wanted that position, to be director of the FBI. It's a good position. Lasts for 40 years. Good for Hoover. So Felt wanted that position. Felt got passed over by the Nixon people who put their own operative into Hoover's position, Patrick Gray. Felt thought he was improperly passed over, and he became Deep Throat, a famous source for Woodward in the parking garage, and he passed on information to Woodward for years and years and years, and helped Woodward's investigation. Woodward could not have done the investigation and couldn't have gotten as far as he got without the help from Mark Felt, who gave him inside information about what was going on in the investigation, what the FBI was up to. Woodward and many people for 35 years speculated as to who Deep Throat was. And there are all kinds of theories as to who Deep Throat was. But I don't think anybody identified Mark Felt as being Deep Throat. But ultimately, as you know, he came out right before his death and acknowledged that he was the Deep Throat. So that's kind of an interesting relationship there. Some of these other folks are well-known Watergate characters. I didn't talk about all of it. I can't cover all of them, but a couple of them I just want to mention. Donald Segretti was many, as we all know, many, in fact, the majority of key characters in Watergate were lawyers. Segretti was one of them. Donald Segretti was a young lawyer who was a dirty trickster. He ultimately, like almost all the other people with one exception, was ultimately convicted or pled guilty and served time in prison for his misdeeds. But Segretti did things like he managed to get letterhead from the various opposing candidates during the 72 Democratic candidates during the 1972 election season, the primary season, and he would type up phony letters on their letterhead and send them to organizations or supporters in a way that would have a negative effect on the candidates. One example, Segretti managed to get George McGovern letterhead, and he wrote he forged a letter to the NAACP on McGovern's letterhead, making serious criticisms and accusations about some of the Black leadership in the country, and asserting, making racial comments to the NAACP on seemingly coming from George McGovern's letterhead. He also was the one who forged the Canuck letter that drove Muskie out of the election. Muskie was a leading Democratic candidate, and there was a flap about a letter in which Muskie had used the word Canuck to describe some people living in north part of New Hampshire, which was a derogatory term back for them. Some of them back then, for some it wasn't, but it ultimately blew up in his face, and it led him to step out of the race, even though he's a leading candidate. So that's kind of some of the stuff Segretti was up to, and he ultimately was charged. He wasn't involved in the Watergate break-in, but these other dirty tricks were kind of part of that milieu. Because when we talk about Watergate, we're talking about much more than the break-in. The break-in was just the tip of the iceberg to what Watergate was all about. But I pop up again in the Watergate story with Segretti. Segretti lost his license to practice law, but he ultimately regained his license. He was disbarred, but he ultimately regained his license, as many of the Watergate characters did. And Segretti was practicing law in the late 1990s, 25 years after Watergate. He was back practicing law in California. I was, and still am, licensed in California. And at that time, I did a little bit of work in California. I don't do much now, but I had some of my practice was in California at that time, not much. But I had a case, a civil case, that involved, there were 4 defendants. I represented 2 of them, and there was the 2 other defendants, and they were accused of covertly diverting cable television networking from phone lines, as it was done back then, into private homes, including their own. So they're basically charged with stealing cable television wiring. I represented a couple of them in a civil lawsuit. The other 2 who were accused in that case were represented by Segretti. Small coincidence there. So I ended up going out to California to meet with my clients and work on the case. And yeah, I didn't know who the other 2 defendants, and this was a civil case, not criminal. I didn't know who the other 2 defendants were represented until we had a meeting, a joint meeting, and in comes Segretti representing the other 2 defendants. And I looked at him, and he said, "Hello, I'm Don Segretti." And I said, "Aren't you?" And I pointed to him, and I said, "Aren't you?" And he said, "Yes, I am." End of conversation. But he did a pretty workmanlike job in that case, as did I, and we ultimately resolved the matter favorably in our client's behalf. And I had the opportunity to work with Mr. Segretti, and he played it straight, and no dirty tricks from him in that case. At any rate, Bernstein and Woodward were writing some stories about Watergate in the early days. Nobody else was covering it at all, and their stories were not prominent, but they were basically following up on what happened, what were the criminal proceedings involving the 5 burglars. That's when the Watergate broke, and that's when the first major Minnesota connection occurred, unless you consider me a Minnesota connection, but I don't. At any rate, Bernstein, who had been bylined on some of the articles, gets a call from a bank teller in Miami, Florida. And the bank teller contacts Bernstein. This is well before internet and emails and text messages, and says, "Mr. Bernstein, I've seen your name on some of these articles, and you might be interested in some information I have down here." And Bernstein said, "Well, what is it?" And the bank teller says, well, I really can't talk about over the phone, but I think I have some information that may have a bearing on what you and your colleague are writing about. So Woodward goes down there. He had an expense account. Bernstein didn't even have an expense account because he was so lowly on the totem pole. But Woodward goes down to Miami, and the teller shows him a photocopy of a check. The check was written on the a CREEP bank account, Committee to Re-elect the President, for $25,000, and it was signed and negotiated on behalf of Kenneth Dahlberg. Kenneth Dahlberg was a Minnesotan, lived in Deep Haven, western suburbs here in Minnesota. Dahlberg was a World War II veteran and a hero. He was a World War II flying hero and had a number of very successful combat missions in World War II. Then he came back to Minnesota after the war and lived here in Minnesota. And he was the founder of a company that's still going strong. I just saw their advertisement on TV last night, Miracle Ear. He developed and formed Miracle Ear, which was the first post-World War II hearing aid of modern hearing aid. Up until then, I guess they used tin horns, but he developed Miracle Ear, and it was a multi-billion-dollar company under Kenneth Dahlberg's auspices. Its Miracle Ear was located, its headquarters were located in Golden Valley, Minnesota. For those of you who are interested, it was right off of Highway 55 near Theodore Wirth Park. There's an industrial area behind Theodore Wirth Park, and Miracle Ear's headquarters was in that area, right west on Highway 55 and Theodore Wirth Parkway, just in the outskirts of Minneapolis in the eastern portion of Golden Valley. That's where Miracle Ear was headquartered. In fact, there's a street there named Dahlberg Drive. As you can see here, there's a street. Dahlberg Drive is located right behind the golf course in Theodore Wirth and at the boundary of Minneapolis and Golden Valley. It's named after Kenneth Dahlberg, the founder of Miracle Ear, and the Miracle Ear company was located right there. It now is owned by a Canadian company. It has Minneapolis. It has a headquarters. It has Minnesota headquarters in downtown in the Skyway, but it's owned by a Canadian company. But back then, it was a Minnesota-bred company. At any rate, back to Dahlberg. Dahlberg was the Midwest finance chair for CREEP. So Dahlberg headed up fundraising and spending, I guess, but fundraising in the Midwest for CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. His check was written for $25,000, and it was written to Bernard Barker, and that's the account it was put in that Miami bank. Bernard Barker was one of the 4 Cubans who were part of the break-in. In fact, he was the lead Cuban. He was the guy who recruited the other Cubans. He was a big player in the Miami Cuban exile community, and he was one of the 5 people in the break-in. And the check written from CREEP for $25,000 to Barker, it turned out, was the funding for the Watergate burglars. That $25,000 was what was paid to the 4 burglars to join McCord breaking into the Watergate. That was the seed money for Watergate. It came from Kenneth Dahlberg, Minnesota Midwest finance chair, the Minnesota entrepreneur. And incidentally, Dahlberg had been a strong financial and otherwise supporter of Hubert Humphrey in the years past. So Dahlberg was a Humphrey supporter, Humphrey backer, but he ended up in 1972 backing the Committee to Re-elect the President. Dahlberg's role as Midwest finance chair, he worked under the auspices of another Minnesota, Maurice Stans. Maurice Stans was the secretary of the Department of Commerce in the Nixon administration. He was a Minnesotan. He comes from Shakopee. He was known in some circles as the bag man for the Nixon administration and was engaged in a lot of major fundraising. One of his major fundraising efforts got him indicted for fraud along with John Connolly. That was not a Watergate event, but it kind of ties into Watergate because it involved illegal fundraising and illegal campaign fundraising. And Stans and Conley were tried together in New York on that. This was pre-Watergate, but it kind of precipitated, it was a foreshadowing of what would later happen in Watergate. John Conley was the Secretary of Treasury under Nixon. Stans, the Minnesotan, was the Secretary of Department of Commerce. That's the same John Conley who was the former Lyndon Johnson protege and former governor of Texas. And yes, that was the John Conley who was in the motorcade in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963, sitting right in front of John F. Kennedy, and was shot along with Kennedy. But at any rate, Conley and Stans were acquitted of that charge. And that, with one exception, with one other exception, was the only acquittal of any of the shenanigans and chicanery involved related to Watergate, or indirectly or directly. But they were acquitted of that offense. But he's a Minnesota guy, and he was the essentially Stahlberg supervisor. At any rate, when Woodward sees this check and he made a copy of it and brought it back, he recognized, he and Bernstein talked about it, and they recognized that, wait a minute, this is more than just a burglary here. There may be a connection here between those burglars and the White House and President Nixon. They figured it out when they saw the check that it came from creep. Bernstein, and this was still in the early days of Watergate, Bernstein and Woodward then took that check to Ben Bradley, the famous editor of the Washington Post, and Bradley had the publisher, Katharine Graham of the Washington Post, meet with Bernstein and Woodward, who at that point were still low-level covering a crime story. And they showed Bernstein, they showed Bradley and Kathleen, Mrs. Graham, the check, and they explained the significance of that check, a $25,000 check to Bernard Barker, one of the burglars, coming from the committee to re-elect the president. And they said, we think that this is more to this than just a third-rate burglary. And they asked for it to be assigned to investigate the whole situation and given some additional resources and really turn this into the story it became. Bradley looked at the check, talked to Graham a bit, looked over at her, and said 3 words to Bernstein and Woodward: go for it. That launched the Woodward-Bernstein and media reporting. Up until then, it was a crime story. Then it became a front-page story and led to all the other investigative steps they took. As the Washington Post got way out in front of this, other media picked it up, but much later. The New York Times did not write about Watergate at all for about 5 months. Other media barely touched it. But after the election, which Nixon won in a landslide, other media jumped on the bandwagon, but they were all following the Washington Post. And the reason the Washington Post was out in front is because Woodward answered his phone that Saturday morning and went to the courthouse, and because of this the check from Dahlberg, which escalated the Washington Post coverage. Things started to turn around at that point too. On the television, there were only three networks back then, but the television news wasn't covering it at all because it wasn't a good visual story. But once the Woodward-Bernstein articles started appearing, some of the other media jumped on aboard, and Walter Cronkite on the 30-minute CBS nightly news devoted a 17-minute segment to Watergate. This is 6 or 7 months later. And given the fact that the nightly news in those days that's all you had, and it was 30 minutes, but with commercials stripping out the commercials, it was 23 minutes. 17 minutes of network time was a big deal. It also was highlighted by something that never happened before or since. Walter Cronkite stood up from his desk. He walked over to a blow up like this, and he started explaining the Watergate connection and all the different players and all these different names and checks and everything. And once Walter Cronkite did that, that endorsed the notion that this is a big story and other media ought to cover it. Oftentimes television lags behind print media. In that case, when Cronkite did it, the print media said, okay, this is a real story now. And it was. More Watergate, more Minnesota connections in Watergate. As I said, Watergate, we've seen how Watergate, Minnesota was the ground zero for the start of Watergate, that $25,000 check from Dahlberg to Barker. Shortly after Watergate broke, John Mitchell, who was the Attorney General in the Nixon administration, Mitchell had two hats. He was the Attorney General. He also was the chair of CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. He didn't do it concurrently. He did step down from the Attorney General's position, but there wasn't much of a gap there. So Mitchell was the head of CREEP, John Mitchell. Shortly after the Watergate break-in, Mitchell, who knew he was up to his eyeballs or more, stepped down and resigned from CREEP. He just stepped away from it. Some of you may have seen the really good series, Stars series this summer about Mitchell and Martha Mitchell. It's called Gaslight, and it was a story. It was Watergate from the perspective of Martha Mitchell. It was a very interesting and well done series. Who did not get any Emmy Award nomination, not even a nomination for it, but it was an interesting Stars episodic series this summer. At any rate, when Mitchell stepped down from CREEP, the deputy of CREEP, his deputy, stepped into that position. That was Clark McGregor, another Minnesotan. Clark McGregor was a congressman from Minnesota representing the 3rd district. That at that time was the western suburbs. Almost all the western suburbs of Minneapolis was encompassed in the 3rd district. Bloomington and Richfield and St. Louis Park and Golden Valley and Wayzata and Minnetonka, Plymouth. Those were all in the 3rd district. It was a solid Republican district. And McGregor had held that position very easily for a decade. And he was a Republican, sort of a moderate Republican of that era. In 1970, Hubert Humphrey was, in 1970, there was a vacancy in the Minnesota Senate, in the Senate from Minnesota. The 2 senators from Minnesota were Walter Mondale. Mondale was appointed after Humphrey became vice president, and Gene McCarthy, Clean Gene of Vietnam fame. McCarthy resigned. McCarthy did not run for re-election, so there was an open seat in Minnesota for Minnesota as senator. Humphrey, who had spent 2 years back here in Minnesota after losing the 1968 election, wanted that seat. The Nixon administration was very concerned that Humphrey would be a contender for president in 1972. The polls had Humphrey above Nixon back then, and Humphrey wanted to run for president in 72, but he needed to get back in the Senate to have a platform. The Nixon people wanted to do whatever they could to defeat or at least make it difficult for Humphrey to win, to prevail. They knew that Humphrey would probably win because he was so popular in Minnesota in 1970, but they wanted to recruit a strong candidate to run against Humphrey and maybe keep his percentage down and bruise him a bit in anticipation of 1972. So the Nixon administration recruited Clark McGregor, who had this safe seat in Minnesota, to run against Humphrey, which was somewhat of an electoral suicide mission because Humphrey was probably going to win. But in order to make that, to give up his seat, McGregor extracted from the Nixon administration a promise that if he lost, if he lost, the Nixon administration would see to it that he got a decent position somewhere in Washington, D.C. So it was kind of a quid pro quo. Hey, Clark, we know you're giving up a good seat here. I mean, you're probably not going to win, but if you'll run a good race, we'll find something for you here in D.C. McGregor ran and was thrashed. Humphrey won big. And he went to Washington. So McGregor had given up his congressional seat, but he was in Washington, D.C. doing what former Congress people do, kind of lobbying and hanging around Washington, D.C. And when CREEP was formed the next year, 1971, when the Committee to Re-elect the President was formed, anticipating the 1972 election, the Nixon administration, to its credit, lived up to its promise. They appointed McGregor as the deputy chief to Mitchell. When Mitchell resigned as CREEP head because of Watergate, McGregor took over as the head of CREEP. And in the early days of Watergate, even beyond that, from Mitchell's resignation a few days after the break-in through the election in November, Clark McGregor headed CREEP. McGregor has never been accused, was never accused, he's since passed away, but he was never accused of any wrongdoing or complicity or knowledge about Watergate. No one has ever suggested that. There was never any contention that McGregor knew what was going on. He didn't, apparently, and he was kept in the dark about it. But because he didn't know what was going on, that ultimately led to him deferring any kind of media inquiry to the White House. The media people would be asking, after the creep connection became known about the check, the media people would be asking McGregor for, what's going on here? Why is a $25,000 check from creep going to the burglars? And a lot of other questions. And by this time, lines were being connected here between some of the participants, Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt and all the folks in the White House. These lines the intersections were now being drawn. McGregor was the point person for trying to answer these questions and trying to fend off the media. He didn't and couldn't because he didn't know much about it, and the White House kept him in the dark. So rather than responding to these questions and putting out news releases or any kind of information, the committee for re-elect the president under McGregor's leadership basically deferred everything to the White House and said, we don't know anything about it. If you want any information about this, you have to talk to the White House. Well, that raised some eyebrows. They said, wait a minute. So you're kind of acknowledging that there's some connection here between the White House and the Watergate burglars, and that fell back on the White House then to handle damage control. And we saw how good a job they did on that. And that, again, facilitated and encouraged the cover-up, because now the White House, creep had handed the ball over to the White House, said, hey, you guys run with it. We don't want anything to do with it. So McGregor stayed out of it. And because he stayed out of it, that probably kept him out of the cover-up and any kind of criminal complicity as well. McGregor served in that position through the election. And after the election, of course, there was no need for the committee to re-elect the president. McGregor stayed on in Washington, D.C. as a lobbyist and lawyer and doing what ex-congressmen do, and had a relatively spotless career. He passed away about a decade ago, but was never accused of any kind of Watergate complicity. The extent of his Watergate involvement, though, was his inability or refusal to engage in what was going on, and therefore submitting everything to the White House, and the people there then engaged in the cover-up. Another Minnesota connection of sorts was Charles Colson. Colson was called the counselor to the president, not to be confused with John Dean. John Dean was counsel in the White House. John Dean was a lawyer, we all know, and he was the White House lawyer. Colson, also a lawyer, had a title of counselor to the president. That was his official title. His unofficial title was the nastiest man in Washington, D.C. And that's a pretty high bar. But Colson was known far and wide for being Nixon's hitman. He had been with Nixon for over 25 years and had done a lot of dirty work for Nixon. And he was implicated deeply in Watergate because he was the one who recruited Howard Hunt. Hunt was an old CIA man. Colson recruited him to the White House before Watergate. Hunt's job was to engage in all kinds of chicanery under Colson's direction. He forged some cables, telegram cables, during the fall of the Diem brothers in Vietnam, in which he tried to implicate President Kennedy and the Kennedy administration in the assassination of the Vietnamese leaders. He also tried to create documents that would implicate the Kennedy administration in more improprieties in connection with the Bay of Pigs and all kinds of other stuff like that under Colson's direction. Hunt was a friend of a fellow named Gordon Liddy. They were neighbors and friends. Hunt then recruited Liddy into this cabal, and Liddy, as we all know, is the person who structured the Watergate break-in. That was his operation. He was the one who put it together, along with a number of other aspects. So that was a connection between Colson, Hunt, Liddy, burglars, the rest of them. Well, Colson afterwards he pled guilty and he served some time in prison. And after he got out of prison, he formed a prisoner fellowship program. And it was a national program that provided post-prison rehabilitation for prisoners. And it was a very beneficial nonprofit organization, and a lot of mini fellowship programs sprung up around the country. But Colson basically developed the concept of having a nonprofit organization that would aid and assist prisoners in kind of getting back into society and rehabilitating themselves. Colson, Minnesota had a significant prisoner fellowship program here in the 1990s and into the early part of this millennium. The executive director of the program was terminated for various reasons, not for wrongdoing, but there were some performance issues allegedly, and the executive director of the program here in Minnesota, the prisoner fellowship program, was terminated. She then hired me as her lawyer to try to work out a severance arrangement, a separation package, and a fairly, I won't say mundane, but a fairly straightforward type of severance. And my job was to get her some kind of severance package because she was terminated. I ended up contacting the headquarters of the organization in DC to see who I would talk to, and they put me through to Mr. Colson. And they said, well, this is who you have to talk to because he's his executive director. So I said, well, I said, Mr. Colson, who I like to talk about getting a severance package for my client. And I said, who is the lawyer? He says, well, I'm handling that. So I ended up negotiating the severance package for the executive director of the prisoner fellowship program here in Minnesota with Mr. Colson himself. I always call him Mr. Colson. And it went fairly smoothly, and he handled it himself, former lawyer, and it wasn't, there was a couple of unusual twists to it, but ultimately we worked on a severance agreement, and I thought it went pretty well, and he handled it well, and that was another connection I had with Watergate. So I kind of pop up like a Zelig character in Watergate here, time to time. I used the phrase Zelig earlier in one of these presentations, and someone said, "Well, you're more like Forrest Gump." So either way. Either I'm a Forrest Gump or a Zelig or both of the above or none of the above, but I keep popping up here. At any rate, those are some of the, so as I indicated, Minnesota provides the ground zero beginning of Watergate with the funding from Dahlberg and Stanz's role. During Watergate, Minnesota plays a significant role because Clark McGregor is the head of CREEP. You got Colson behind the scenes there, and ultimately Colson had the Minnesota connection. So Minnesota is involved during Watergate. And as Watergate finally winds down, Minnesota pops up again. As you know, a special counsel was appointed to investigate Watergate. The Congress passed a special counsel law back in 1972 as Watergate was developing, 73 actually, to appoint an outside special investigator. The person who was appointed was Archibald Cox. Archibald Cox was a Harvard law professor, politically connected to the Kennedys, and he was the person who initially started the official Watergate legal investigation. That special counsel law is still on the books, and it's been used, as you know, on several occasions. The Contra-Iran-Gate Oliver North situation was subject to a special prosecutor investigation. There have been some other ones too. And when the January 6th matter broke, some people speculated that Merrick Garland might invoke the special prosecutor law and appoint someone to investigate and possibly prosecute because of, to remove it from alleged political conflict of interest. He didn't, but that law is still on the books. At any rate, Archibald Cox was the investigator, special counsel investigator, investigating Nixon. During that time, there was some belief that Nixon had some tapes of conversations he had. This was well before the taping system was known, but it was surmised that Nixon may have taped some of his conversations. Archibald Cox got a subpoena to the White House for 8 specific tapes. They didn't know they existed, but 8 dates. He said, we want any tapes of these 8 dates of these conversations. And he subpoenaed them from Nixon. That led to the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon then fired Cox, closed down the special prosecutor's office. Some of you remember the famous film of the FBI under Nixon's protege, sealing off the special prosecutor's office, removing all the boxes, putting tape up there, and that shut down the special prosecutor's office at the time. Well, that led to a huge eruption, and that was really the turning point of Watergate, because a new special prosecutor was appointed, and that was Leon Jaworski, the head of the ABA, and Jaworski picked up from where Cox was, and he continued the investigation, and it was and then during that investigation, meanwhile, so Jaworski is investigating Watergate. the Senate and House are holding these hearings, and it was the Senate hearings, the Irvin Committee hearings. That's where John Dean testified, and that was where Dean testified. And most of the testimony took place at those hearings before the Senate. That was the Irvin Committee, and that was a bipartisan committee. And Dean famously described the meetings he had with Nixon, and in particular the March 17th meeting in the Oval Office, in which Dean said that he informed Nixon that the Watergate burglars were going to come before Judge Sirica and say where their connections were and how this was all orchestrated by these higher ups, because up to then it was just these 5 guys. And Dean told Nixon that they needed $1 million to pay off or bribe the Watergate burglars. And Dean also told Nixon that there's a cancer on the presidency. It's growing day by day. That was a quote that Dean used. He said, we need $1 million for the Watergate burglars. Nixon said, that's no problem, John. We have the money for that. And he nodded to Haldeman. Haldeman did have the money for that because Haldeman had a safe in his office that had a lot of cash in there, maybe not $1 million, but they had enough money to bribe the Watergate burglars if they wanted to. It never got to that point, but it may have. At any rate, when Dean testified, he was crucified by the administration and the supporters as being a liar and not credible. Some of the same kinds of things we've heard about some of the testimony before the January 6th committee. There's some parallels there. And Dean was not widely believed. He was believed by many quarters, but there was a lot of criticism of Dean that he was making this up. He wasn't credible. It was all a big lie. Nixon said that he barely knew Dean. He had said, I just saw him on the hallway a few times. I knew he was counsel doing legal work, but I had no contact with Dean during all this. And Dean was, in fact, the person who was orchestrating the cover-up in the early days. But Nixon said he didn't know Dean very well. Ultimately, when it came out that they had the Nixon tapes, when all those tapes came out, it was determined that Nixon and Dean met 47 times to talk about Watergate. Nixon had a bad memory. He didn't remember any of them, but 47 times they spoke. And the phrase that Dean used about cancer in the presidency was actually on the tape. So Dean's testimony was verified when those tapes came out. Meanwhile, the special prosecutor continues. The House then voted, the House Judiciary Committee voted to impeach Nixon. Nixon was never impeached. We all know that. He was not impeached, but the House Judiciary Committee, by a vote of 27-17, voted with 6 Republicans. The committee had, I think it was 21 and 11, 21 Democrats, 11 Republicans. 6 Republicans joined the Democrats, and they voted on 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon, the House Judiciary Committee. The first one, and the main one, was obstruction of justice. There were 2 other charges as well, but the obstruction of justice one was the one that caught most attention. And then the House was going to vote on impeachment within a matter of a week or 2. At the same time, the Supreme Court issued its decision requiring those tapes to be produced. So the House Judiciary Committee voted to impeach Nixon, or to recommend impeachment. The Supreme Court ruled that Nixon had to give up the tapes. He did, although there was some concern that he might go on the White House lawn and burn them. But Nixon did. This is in early August 1974, and that led to the famous march from the Capitol to the White House, led by 8 senior Republicans, headed by Barry Goldwater. 8 of them came to the White House on August 7th, while the House was about to consider impeachment. And Nixon said to them, well, I know I'm going to lose in the House. I'm going to be impeached in the House. It was heavily Democratic. But he said, Barry, what are my chances in the Senate? And Goldwater on August 7th said, Mr. President, you have about 5 votes there, and I'm not one of them. Nixon resigned the next day. And that was how that played out. Meanwhile, the special prosecutor's office is still going on with prosecutions. Most of the Watergate criminal prosecutions happened after Nixon resigned. And there were a number of criminal proceedings taken on by Leon Jaworski in the Watergate special prosecutor's office. 2 of them ended up here in Minnesota. And they were 2 of the last prosecutions of that special prosecutor's office. This is a special prosecutor's office that's traceable to the initiation of Watergate. This was the same office that Archibald Cox headed, the same office that was the source of the Saturday Night Massacre, the same office that went to the Supreme Court to get Nixon's tapes, and it was prosecuting Watergate-related cases, mostly in Washington, D.C. but there were two cases that ended up here in Minnesota. One of them was United States versus Andreas. Dwayne Andreas was a prominent businessman here in Minnesota. He was the founder and head of Archer Daniels Midland, a company that still exists. It was the world's second largest grain company, big player. And Andreas was a big player too. He was charged in 1974, as Watergate was winding down. The special prosecutor's office brought a charge, a criminal charge against Andreas for making an illegal $100,000 political contributions. Back in those days, corporations could not contribute to political campaigns. That's been watered down quite a bit by Citizens United, but it was illegal for corporations to make political contributions to federal candidates. Archer Daniels Midland, Andreas is the head of Archer Daniels Midland, had given 10 of his executives $10,000 bonuses, which was a lot of money in those days, and they were directed to pay that money into to make a political contribution, not to Nixon. It was 1968, they supported Humphrey. So Andreas orchestrated $10,000 payments to the Humphrey campaign in 1968. And as part of the Watergate investigation, that surfaced. So he was charged not with Watergate offenses, but was charged with financing offenses relating to the 1968 campaign of Humphrey. He was tried here in Minnesota for these illegal contributions. That the claim was that he was siphoning off corporate money by giving them to his executives, but telling them to make the contributions in their own name. The case was tried here in Minnesota. All of the judges, the federal judges in Minnesota, recused themselves because they all had connections with Andreas or members of Andreas's family because he was so well connected. So a federal district judge from Northern District of Iowa, Judge McManus, was brought up here to Minnesota to try that case, and was tried in the courthouse in downtown Minneapolis. The case was a bench trial. Andreas waived the jury and tried the case before the judge, Judge McManus. Judge McManus came up from Iowa to try that case. He didn't have a law clerk with him, so he needed a law clerk. I, at the time, was a law clerk for one of the federal judges here in Minnesota, Earl Larson, and I was enlisted, happily, to be his law clerk for that case. There I am again, Forrest Gump. So I'm the law clerk for Judge McManus, hearing the bench trial of Dwayne Andreas for making illegal contributions to the 1968 campaign of Humphrey, which surfaced during the Watergate investigation. A lot of dots to connect there. Andreas was acquitted. The judge determined that there was reasonable doubt as to whether he had made these illegal contributions knowingly, because what surfaced during the case was some documents indicating that these $10,000 payments to the executives, which were called a bonus at the time, were documented to be corporate loans, and they had to repay them. And so the judge reasoned that because these were loans, they weren't really flat out payments by the company to the Humphrey campaign. And because under the criminal law standard, there was some reasonable doubt, and the defendant was acquitted. Now, I'm not at liberty to talk about what happened in the deliberations, but I will say this, the judge and his law clerk differed on that outcome, but as is usually the case, the judge prevailed. A couple of years later, another Watergate prosecution occurs here in Minnesota. This is the special prosecutor's office. This was the curtain of Watergate. The last action by the special prosecutor's office, the last lawsuit, the last case arising out of Watergate was prosecuted here in St. Paul at the downtown St. Paul courthouse. The case was U.S. versus 3M. And this is it arose in 1975-76, and the trial court ultimately went up to the 8th Circuit in 1977. This case was also a Watergate-related case. It involved illegal contributions of $30,000, which was kind of, that's a lot of money back then, but not huge by even those standards. And 3M had made a $30,000 corporate contribution to the Nixon campaign, the CREEP campaign, in 1972. They were prosecuted for that, and they ultimately entered into a plea agreement in which they admitted liability as a corporation, and they were criminally found guilty of illegal corporate contributions to the Nixon campaign in 72. Case closed on that. However, during the ongoing investigation, it was discovered that 3M had taken tax deductions for those payments. And that's a no-no. So they got re-prosecuted. So the special prosecutor's office, the Watergate special prosecutor, brought a criminal charge against 3M for illegal tax deductions based upon its illegal financial contributions. That case was tried before Judge Alsop in downtown St. Paul, and he dismissed the charge against the company on the grounds that as part of the plea agreement that was entered into in connection with the illegal campaign contributions, in the plea agreement, the government said that it was waiving and releasing any and all claims against 3M relating to financial contributions to the Nixon campaign. And the 3M raised that and said, we have a release here. The government's argument was, no, we didn't release those claims. We just released the claims for illegal contributions. This is a tax charge. But Judge Alsop deemed that the release was written in such a ambiguous way and was written so broadly that it allowed the 3M to claim that it was releasing all claims, even claims that were not being prosecuted at the time. And 3M was therefore, the case was dismissed against 3M, and the dismissal was upheld by the 8th Circuit. One other Watergate related case, and I'll close here because I know we're running over our time a little bit. And this really isn't Watergate as such, but I thought it was kind of interesting looking at the context and circumstance of Watergate. This is a 1976 Minnesota case. This has nothing to do with Watergate, sort of, but it was a civil fraud case, and there was the plaintiff won $34,000 verdict in district court here in Minnesota, and the appeal was brought to the Minnesota Supreme Court, and the verdict was overturned because the closing argument of the plaintiff's lawyer was deemed to be inflammatory. What was inflammatory about it? This was tried back in 1974, 1975 in the height of Watergate. The Supreme Court said that the plaintiff's lawyer stepped out of bounds in his closing argument by asserting that there was a, quote, cover-up and making references to Watergate. And the court said, well, that's inflammatory. It has nothing to do with this case. It's prejudicial to bring Watergate into a civil fraud case here in Minnesota. So that's an example, I guess, of how Watergate seeped into the litigation lore here in Minnesota. The Watergate prosecutions closed the circle on Watergate, and it really essentially ended here. So as we've seen, Watergate started here with the Dahlberg check. It continued here with some of the key personages from Minnesota being involved in creep and some of the financial issues, and it ended here with the final 2 criminal prosecutions of Watergate related here in Minnesota. So that's why I think it's appropriate to deem Minnesota as being ground zero for the beginning, middle, and end of Watergate. Any questions, comments? Well, real quickly, I have a Watergate trivia. We have a few moments here. This is my Watergate trivia questions here. All right. I guess we don't have many people out here to answer them, but you can give your own answers as you can. I'll give you 3 seconds to come up with an answer, and then I'll tell you the answers. What law enforcement agency did G. Gordon Liddy formerly work for? I'll give you a few seconds to ponder that. He was an FBI agent, special agent with the FBI was Gordon Liddy before Watergate. Liddy was the last Watergate prisoner in jail. How long was he in jail? 4 years. That's right. Liddy was jailed for 4 years, and he was sentenced to 20 years in jail for his misdeeds. But President Carter commuted his sentence in 1979. What was the title of John Dean's tell-all book? Got a famous title to it, and it's another one of these phrases that comes from Watergate. Blind Ambition. It's a pretty good book, and that launched Dean on his post-Watergate career, which is Watergate. I mean, I think if you ask him, what do you do for a living? His living is Watergate, but he does a pretty good job at it. The Martha Mitchell Stars series that I mentioned was called Gaslight. It involved 2 famous actors. Gaslight, the 2 actors in the Gaslight Stars series was Julia Roberts played Martha Mitchell. Sean Penn played John Mitchell, and he was a better John Mitchell than John Mitchell. So if you have a chance to see that, I urge you to take a look at any or all of the 6 episodes. Who did a post-Watergate 4-part TV interview with President Nixon? He had a daytime talk show. He was a British entertainer, David Frost. That was a big deal at the time. It happened a couple of years after Watergate. It's the only time Nixon has really officially spoken on Watergate. Nixon, incidentally, has never apologized never recanted for his role in Watergate, but he was paid $100,000 for per episode of 4 interviews with Frost. One of them, and only one, was devoted to Watergate. And that was the first one. The other ones dealt with other issues, foreign affairs and other things. But that in the first episode he had with Frost, he made the famous statement. Frost said, "Do you have any regrets? Do you think you did anything wrong?" And Nixon said, "Well, comma, if the president does it, it's not illegal," unquote. That was the Nixon quote from his Frost interview. And it was a Nixon mentality. And that phrase and that remark still resonates today in certain quarters. The 18-minute tape gap, we saw that. That was Rosemary Woods. What Watergate figure became a post-jail fiction author? That was John Ehrlichman. Who became a minister? That was Jeb Magruder. Went in different directions. And my last question is, did you enjoy this presentation? Hope you did. Hope you learned a little bit about Watergate and the role, the significant, prominent, essential role that Minnesota played before, during, and after Watergate. Thank you very much.